So we have Donna back from Parker Equine Insurance. And this one, you have an Irishman talking to a lady in California, folks. So we could not have different climates. And while I might think I'm safe in this department, I know that we are anything but, even here in rainy Ireland. This, folks, is going to be 3 tips to, I would say, general barn safety, but also preventing those barn fires as well. It's a pretty serious one. Donna, what are we going to do to keep that stable barn safer?
The first thing I'd like to say, and I don't know how it is in Ireland, but in the U.S., the statistic is from the time you see the fire to the time that the barn is fully involved is 7 to 12 minutes. So that means you have 7 to 12 minutes to notify the fire department, get the horses out if there's any in there, and get on with it, right? So that's not very much time. So I think the key to this is prevention as much as possible. And so I think we've all walked into a barn and you look and there's cobwebs everywhere and there's dust from the shavings and the straw and hay, and it's not been cleaned up. Well, all of that dust and cobwebs, that's all flammable. So all it takes is a little spark from an electrical outlet to ignite all that, and it's going to go. So I think the main tip number 1 is to clean up all the clutter. So clean the cobwebs regularly, the dust, throw out the feed bags and the twine and any trash. Keep the dry leaves. I know in Ireland they're not dry, but keep the leaves away from the barn. Trim your trees that are touching the roof line. And then in California especially, clear away the dry grass and the brush from the structures to provide a fire break in the event of a wildfire. You have a little bit of extra time before it gets to your barn. So I would say that's tip number 1.
That's tip number 1. And, in all seriousness, we are having the hottest summers that we've ever had. And that climate is changing and not for the better. And so these are really good tips for everybody. And I actually think that, in somewhere where you may be used to this and it's in your conscious mind because it's happened before, you can be more on top of this. But actually, UK and Europe, we're not as accustomed to it, but it's only going to be a more frequent outcome, unfortunately. So this is really useful stuff because it's absolutely the number 1 thing that no one wants to look out their window and see happening, because it's going to be life-changing if it does. So tip number 2, Donna.
Tip number 2, what I'd say is check all your electrical wiring and equipment and do it annually. So you even maybe want to have a professional come out and just look for areas that maybe need to be repaired or updated. And then make sure all your electrical lines run through a metal conduit so that if the little rodents that are out there and making their nest, if they chew through the wire, and that can cause a spark and cause a fire. If you have fans or other equipment, have them professionally installed and wired in, and so that so you don't have cords hanging where horses might get to them, or that you can get a buildup of dust or a spark. Again, if you're going to have heaters, having them professionally installed, and then just unplug anything you're not using, the clippers, the vacuum, other appliances, when they're not in use, just unplug them so that they don't become a fire hazard.
Yeah, I love that. And look, usually there's something once a year that breaks or needs fixing, and you're going to have a professional, whether it's an electrician or whether it's just someone who really knows their hardware better than we probably do. So, you might even just get away with making them an extra cup of tea and just saying, you couldn't just spend 5 minutes walking around and seeing, do you spot anything here that I'm not seeing in terms of a hazard? So
do it regularly too. I think time goes by, mark it on your calendar and do it every year.
Cool. Great tip. And last one?
Last one is, this is going to sound silly, but install fire extinguishers, the big 10-pound ABC fire extinguishers, and you want to make sure that they're marked, and there's one at every entrance of the barn. And if you have a big barn, you maybe want to have 1 or 2 in the mid part of the barn. And again, make sure they're marked clearly. Make sure they're, you don't have blankets hanging over them or something. Make sure people know where they are. And then the other thing is to make sure that they're checked annually to make sure if you do have a fire, and last thing you want is to pull a fire extinguisher that's already, that's out of date or hasn't been charged. and it doesn't work. So I would say that's my last major tip.
You're setting alarm bells going off in my head again, because we moved to this farm 20 years ago in Ireland, and we brought our fire extinguishers with us. And I'm pretty sure that there's one or two that if I pulled the trigger on them, I would say I would be lucky if even some rust came out. So that is a job. That is a job I'm going to get done. Thank you so much for joining us again, and thank you for those tips.
Perfect. Thank you for having me.
Welcome to the Ratings of Benting podcast and a Parker Equine Insurance special for you. And today's show, listeners, is looking back on US performances this year. It is the US review of the year, and it feels like it has been a topic of hot conversation over the last, is that right? A hot topic of hot conversation?
No, I think it's a hot topic of conversation.
I was getting myself in all manner of bother there, listeners. I'm just going to dive on in. Dee, save me from myself here. There is lots to talk about on this show.
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting area. I think it's something we've talked about, I would say, in reasonable detail over the last couple of years, because it's been something that's coming and coming and coming. The resurgence of the US, I think it's interesting that it's coming at a time when we're seeing a bit of a drop-off in both depth and quality across Australia and New Zealand, which kind of gives the US a little bit more encouragement in a way to keep this going, because I think Bertoni, Nicole, I'm sure we'll talk about it as part of the review, but to win those medals, you obviously need to finish ahead of other teams. So it's a real sense of encouragement when you even think, say, where Ireland were. You think of those big six nations. Ireland would have just sat outside it. Japan were probably coming for Tokyo, maybe have dropped off a little bit. New Zealand and Australia have been really embedded in there for a long time. The US have been part of that, but let's be honest, they haven't really been performing at a level which has challenged Britain or Germany, and even more so than that, if we're really honest, probably they've been just at the kind of bottom end of the top six, when you still had a strong France team, strong Kiwis and strong Australians. The big change here, and what's really interesting, is as those two, as the Kiwis and the Aussies drop back a little bit, France remain one of those nations that we kind of probably hold off until we see the championship arrive. We don't see them traveling the world, although they are a little bit better at it now, but we don't see them traveling the world with their very top horses all of the time. So I think, Nicole, there's this interesting set of circumstances which the US have been improving. We'll talk about that with some numbers later, but at a very basic level, the number of, just taking something like finishing scores, and the number of times a US horse in an international competition finishes below a score of 32. 32 is an interesting area, because I think if you start thinking about teams, Nicole, to get 3 scores of 32 on the board begins to put you in a position, and it feels easy. It's absolutely not. But, if you can finish a team competition on a score of 96, you're probably in the reckoning, even at times when the Brits have kind of smashed records in the first phase for the last couple of years. The Germans always strong in that first phase and being able to finish on it. Where I'm going with this, Nicole, is back in 2019, the fact of the matter is we just weren't seeing enough US horses able to get below a score of 32. And you can dress that up in all sorts of different ways in terms of the quality of the competition, the level of competition. But to be honest, if you just bring something back to its most basic and say, at 4-star short, 4-star long, and 5-star, these upper levels of the sport, forget the difficulty of the field, forget everything else. Can you finish below a score of 32? The reality is we weren't seeing it that much from the US horses. I think we saw 10 in total in the 2019 season. And by the way, that resurgence was already in place at that point. It was even less the year before. But by 2021, Nicole, that was all the way up at 25 scores across the year had managed to get below that score of 32. This year, it looks like it's going to be about the 20 mark. But it's almost double what it was in 2019, which for me, as a very basic indicator, is just showing us that there's a little bit more depth, and importantly, and it's an ability to compete, I think, on a global stage when you're able to produce scores below 32. Now, we will talk about where those competitions landed. We will talk about the strength of some of those competitions, but as an overall, we've seen a big resurgence. We'll talk at the end of the show about the ratings. We have really positive news for the US in terms of the last 10 years and looking at how horses are currently rated and how they're rated in 2022. We've almost never seen the US so strong. But as part of that, I think let's review the year. Let's look back at some of the key competitions, some really positive, some where we can definitely find room for improvement. But I think we'll probably move a little bit, Nicole, between the numbers and the ratings, which I would say probably offer really good encouragement, and then also the feeling side, because I think there's definitely areas of the year where you're looking at it and you want to see it in a positive sense, but another way, you just feel like, oh, there's a little bit more there, or there has to be a little bit more there if we're gonna compete.
Absolutely, Dee. We're going to dive into looking at that both from a numbers and from a feel perspective, because I think that's important, and we'll have a little bit of opinion sprinkled in there as well. You wouldn't have it any other way, listeners, but I actually just wanted to pick up on that zone analysis that you just touched upon, 4-star short, 4-star long, and 5-star level for the US, going back to 2019. And when I was looking at those numbers, something really stuck out for me. Sub 40 finishes at 5-star level only from US horse and rider combinations in 2019. There were only 4 of them in 2019. So only 4 people across the whole season in 2019 had a sub 40 finish at 5-star from the US. You take that then to 2021, and there were certainly a few more. There were 13, and that has increased again. In 2022, there have actually been 15 sub 40 finishes at 5-star level this year for the US alone. I think that's just really important to show the trajectory of those 5-star finishing scores. And we're going to talk about a few of those performances. Let's dive into the year, because I think let's start with Kentucky. Kentucky's a really interesting one for me because it's obviously a home event for the US. This year, we saw a number of the kind of key US horse and rider combinations, the likes of Tammy Smith, My Barm, the likes of Philip Dutton Z, Ariel Grold, Learmore Masterplan, they chose to go to Badminton. So we'll talk about their performances at Badminton and how they stacked up there in a second. But it meant for me that Kentucky actually lacked some of the US star power. And it felt, and it certainly appeared on paper, like it was run away with slightly. Michael Young, obviously an exceptional result. He finished on 20.1 with Fisher Chipmunk FRH. But that over 18 penalties of the highest placed US combination, who was Doug Quantum Leap in third. Still a brilliant performance to finish third. It was only 3 seconds over the time cross country. 18 penalties at 5-star. It feels like they were a long way off the top spot in Kentucky. Was that just the sheer brilliance of Michael Young and Fisher Chipmunk? Or do you think it actually felt like it wasn't quite the US performances that we wanted at Kentucky?
Oh, no, they definitely didn't perform as they would have wanted. Look, forget the 20.1, world record finishing score at a 5-star level. That's a massive outlier. 20.1 would, as I say, world record. It would have won any 5-star up until that point ever. So forget the 20.1. There's a 10-mark swing then to second with Yaz Ingham and Banzai De Loire, who would go on to become a world champion later in the year, finishing at 31.7. That's probably more reflective of, a winning mark here. 28 dressage. Banzai would be able to go lower than that, and did when they got to the championship. But a little bit of time penalties. We saw time penalties pretty much across the board. I think Philip will be very pleased with the Clouds coming in clear. Sets her leg again for the US with Boyd. But generally, time was very difficult to get. I think alongside Michael, those were the only two that managed to go inside the time at Kentucky. Equally, I would say jumping turned out to be pretty difficult. Sets her leg being really let down. Not let down, maybe that's the wrong word, but like will be really disappointed with 2 down and time penalties, essentially costing them second place for a second time. Sets her leg. So that that show jumping round dropped them down to fourth and bring Doug Payne and Quantum Leap, who jumped clear on the final day, onto the podium. Overall, though, Nicole, I think you would say, would the competition feel slightly different if Tetzer had jumped clear and finished on finished on 29 type area? I think it would feel like it wouldn't have been too far off what was winning 5 stars a few years ago, and wouldn't have been too far off where Boyd's last second place finish was. I think he was about a 28 that day. A couple of years, probably caught how many years ago now? Is it 4 years maybe since Boyd finished second on Tetzer? So
yeah, 2018.
It is small margins, but ultimately for Quantum Leap and for Tetzeleg to be the best of the US on a 38.4 and a 38.5, and book on Carlevo, Book Davidson on Carlevo at 38.6, so almost nothing between third, fourth, and fifth. Just a single mark. 38.4, 38.5, 38.6 for those 3 US riders. It is still a way off. Wherever the penalties came, whether it's Quantum Leap's 37.2 in the first phase, whether it's Tetzeleg adding 9.2 in the show jumping phase, whether it's the 10 time penalties of Carlevo. So they're all pretty much coming from different areas, but all of them you would say it's a massively different result if they finish on a 29.
It's interesting though, because actually I'm just catching myself. Is it our expectation that has changed? It was actually 2019. I got that wrong for a second. That Tetzeleg was second in Kentucky. But if we just revert back to those finishing scores that I just referenced at 5-star 2019, only 4 US horse and rider combinations finished sub 40 at 5-star level in the whole season. By the time we had finished Kentucky, there had already been 3, which was actually much stronger than had been, 3 years previously. And then we were to go on to Badminton, and a week or so later, there would be some very strong US performances, not quite the rattling the top of the podiums, but actually, if we looked at Tammy Smith and Mybalm, who were best of the US combinations at Badminton, they produced the best finishing score by a US competitor at Badminton going back to 2008. They finished on a score of, I think it was 36.5. They finished 9th, and that was the best US finishing score at Badminton since 2008 at least. So I just wonder whether our expectation had changed slightly of us sort of saying, we feel like we were a little bit disappointed with that. But actually, if we're looking at the numbers, that shows that everything was going in the right direction.
Yes and no. I mean, I think yes in that, from an analysis point of view and from a macro point of view, you're absolutely right that beginning to see those sub 40 scores is edging us constantly in the right direction, and that's important when you're looking at something over a 12-month or a 2-year or 3-year program. It's really important to see those little bits of progress in terms of on the day competition and what it means, particularly at that kind of jewel in the crown 5-star of Kentucky, the first big challenge of the year, particularly in the championship year where you've got lots of people trying to put themselves forward. They're well able. Like, it is a one-off performance, but there are horses there that are well able to finish closer to the 30 mark. And closer to the 30 mark here gets them second. Again, forget the 20.1. No one was catching that. Nobody in any country was catching that. But I think all of Quantum Leap, Tetzeleg, and Carlevo for Doug, Boyd, and Bruce for Buck will all be able to look at that performance and say, okay, it was the first phase, it was the time penalties, or it was the 9.2 for Setzer leg in the final phase. And I think it's a completely different feel. I think you're right in terms of stepping back and looking at it from a macro point of view. There is improvement there. I think on the day, that competition feels a little bit different if any one of those three horses are able to deliver what, they can all probably, they're probably all able to be 5 marks better than that in each of those phases. I think that's probably fair. What I would say about it, though, Nicole, is I also think it's interesting that you say, because we had Fisher Chipmunk and Banzai de la War, we have to remember as well that is the top rated horse in the world. Currently, what's Fisher Chipmunk? I think Fisher Chipmunk this year went equal with Labio Statique Sam in terms of international wins of all time. I think they're both now joint equal in terms of most international wins of the last, of their careers essentially. So Chipmunk is right up there. Chipmunk is going to be is a powerhouse, and the 20.1 proved that. But Banzai, we didn't know it at this time, but would also become the world champion. So they are two top horses. It is easy to get drawn into, okay, the Europeans have run away with Kentucky again, but you also look down the list and you see, okay, well, Maybach for Pippa, all those 3 US horses were ahead of them. Calmaro for Ireland, but Joseph Murphy went over there with high hopes. Janelle was there on. Who was Janelle there on? Janelle was there, remind me.
Kentucky.
McLaren. They had a 20. Sarah Bullimore and Karua. That would have been a horse if we were talking about on previous shows that we would have said, look, great show, Karua. Will it be time for Karua to deliver 20 penalties plus that wild round, if you remember, that they had? I think sometimes we write the reviews after when you see the results, but actually there was plenty of really good horses that didn't manage to get around as well as that. All in all, though, I would say there was a tinge of disappointment for me about US performances at Kentucky. Okay. My feeling, whether that's backed up by numbers, I think it's a kind of a middle ground in terms of numbers.
So for me, I was very excited to see that some of the big US combinations actually went over to badminton and really took their chance. And I know that was something that they've been pretty passionate about, of being able to put themselves up against the best in the world and measure themselves against the best in the world. It would have been easy for Tammy Smith and My Barm to say, we're going to stick at Kentucky, and we could well have really, pushed Michael Young very, very close. But they actually decided to go to badminton and take their chance there. There was a really strong US contingent at badminton, and on the whole, they had a really, really solid performances. They had very solid cross-country performances. I think I'm right in saying that they actually didn't have, I'll just double check for you listeners, but I don't think they had any cross-country jumping penalties at badminton this year. Just do a sneaky little search, but I think that cross-country day in particular was a very, very strong phase for them. I tell a lie. They didn't quite. Emily Hamel Corvette and Lillian Hurd LCC Barnaby and Matt Flynn Wizard. Okay, the big guns in Ariel Grohl, Tammy Smith, Philip Dutton, Will Fordry. I guess the ones that you really could have been looking at for team places going to Protoni went and delivered very solid cross-country rounds. The thing that I kind of caught myself thinking at badminton was it hadn't been a stronger performance as I thought they might deliver across the 3 phases. They were good cross-country, picked up time penalties. They were solid in the dressage, but you felt like there were still a few more marks in there. It felt like quite a building block result from badminton. I think they went away from badminton and really kind of analysed where they were at and what they could do differently. I know Tammy spoke pretty candidly on a show recently, I think it was Post Maryland, as to what she looked at post badminton in terms of fitness and the kind of work she was doing with My Barm from that perspective. They were good but not great for me at badminton. And I think then it was really a case of all eyes on Protoni. We obviously had Arkham, which we're going to talk about, but it became a real ride then to September, not only for selection, because I think there was real competition for selection of places for the US team this year. It was by far a foregone conclusion. You weren't in a position to say, oh, this is the team that are going to go. And absolutely, that was the team that went. There was certainly some discussion. And I know when the team was announced, there was still some discussion, which always, I think, in my mind, shows that competition is very, very healthy for squad spots. Let's talk Aachen, because it felt like Aachen the previous year, when Will Coleman had topped the individual podium and the team had gone so well. I think they finished second in the team competition in the SAP Cup. That had felt in 2021, D, like a turning point. And actually Will Coleman in particular went to Aachen again this year and really made his marker.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think the 2021 Aachen, was there anything before that? Certainly from a ratings point of view, the journey began slightly earlier. We're talking about that kind of macro stepping back. It was probably building from even from 2020, although you kind of treat all the 2020 analysis with a degree of
I was going to say, I feel like it was building from that home world championships in 2018 in Tryon, where they missed out an Olympic qualification. That almost felt like rock bottom, being brutal.
Yeah,
it takes a while to turn things around and build things back up, but there's been a real period of change since then. And I think that was the moment that things turned around or started to turn around.
I think you're right in terms of things feeling rock bottom then. I don't think they should have. Essentially, if you remember what happened there in terms of the difference between qualifying and not qualifying was probably Donner having rails on the final day. You can't. If they had finished in the top 6 in Tryon, everyone would have thought, okay, maybe we'd like to be a little bit higher, but things are okay. And if we're honest, that's kind of how things had been for the previous 5 years. You were knocking on the door, but not really ever getting past Brits, Germans, Kiwis, Aussies, and probably the French. So you were 6th of the top 6. That's how it had been. I don't think that really changed at Tryon. I think you're right in that people absolutely felt it was rock bottom. But ultimately, the difference between qualifying and not qualifying was a horse getting rails that doesn't usually get rails. Bit of an outlier performance. Suddenly, it did feel rock bottom. I remember it at the convention that year, we're all just essentially like a post-mortem type feel around the kind of high performance presentation. It wasn't even a high performance presentation. It was just like a presentation to the US eventing public about the Tryon debrief where everyone got this moment to talk about it. Anyway, I do agree with you. Things did feel rock bottom then. I don't think they were. I think you're right in that there's been a steady improvement from probably 2019 onwards in terms of the basics, the finishing scores. There's definitely a moment. I mean, it's sometimes you just need to, when you go back to the micro, Nicole, we talk about, it's one thing to talk about finishing scores. It's another thing just for off the record to go and win Aachen. The lift, the bounce, the confidence, the back on the map feel that everyone begins to get. And as well, I think Will Coleman as well, in particular, he'd been in and out of some of those teams. On some of the teams that he was on, he'd had disappointments cross country. He'd had I think he'd had probably a reasonably difficult, I would say, I don't know, I haven't spoken to him personally about it, but I would say it was quite a difficult 5 years in that he had a pretty good string of horses, but was sort of, behind Philip and Boyd, not really guaranteed a spot, doing everything right. I think it was difficult. I think him winning was a really big moment. And you're right, I think it sets off a chain of events, which comes from confidence then. I think the team then backing it up. I think Ariel Graw's performance, by the way, was also another big turning point. Getting onto the podium at, was it? I always forget this. Is it Lemulan? I think it was Lemulan. They had one of the big top 3 performances, or podium performances from a non-US 5-star. I think pretty much around that same Aachen time for Will. They went back there this year, Nicole. I didn't think Off the Record was good. I wondered, would it be a bit of an outlier year? I wondered, I just thought it was difficult to call it as to, was that just a complete one-off that you see every so often that he managed to do it on? But go back there and, for Will alone, at Aachen to finish 2 horses in the top 10, Off the Record finishing in 6th. On 28.5 dressage, and having one down, he would have been closer. He would have won it without his rail. I mean, that's an easy thing to say, I know, but what I mean is it dropped him right back down. So within a rail of a win and a top 6 finish, and equally then probably not more excitingly, but very promising for the future in that Gin Tonic. For Will manages to go into the top 10 there as well at Aachen, in a difficult field, finishing ahead of lots of huge range of horses. Maybe not the same depth at Aachen this year as there was the previous couple of years, but nonetheless 2 horses in the top 10 backing as an Aachen winner. I think it's a would you say, I don't know, would you say good, not great for the US, or would you say great Aachen?
Good, not great.
I think
they finished 5th. I would say a great Aachen for Will Coleman. I think in terms of the team, they finished in 5th, but they hadn't sent, a squad that they would have sent to the World Championships, for example. It wasn't a World Championship squad. It was
who else was it?
It was QC Diamond Hair.
Or Sydney Elliott.
And Sydney Elliott. It was Brock Davidson and Carl-Ebo.
Yeah, they had 20, I think.
I think there was Palm Crescent as well, Megan O'Donoghue, who I think possibly rode as an individual. I mean, it was a great Aachen for Will Coleman, I think. I mean, I think he would have preferred to have gone back and defended his title, so he might say good, not great, but I'd say pretty damn decent. And I think actually that was a real building block and I guess a consolidation of what then we would see from Off the Record later on in the season. And I think let's talk about Protoni and how the US team shaped up in Protoni, because when we were doing some research for this show, Georgia Patrick found an absolute gem, which I think is really, really important. There's a couple of gems, but particularly when we looked at the World Championships in Protoni this year and the cross-country time penalties, the US averaged the lowest number of cross-country time penalties added by any nation in Protoni. Now, if you'd have said to me going into Protoni, the US are going to be essentially the quickest team at the World Championships, that's ahead of the Germans, ahead of the Brits, ahead of the Kiwis, ahead of the Aussies, whoever it may be, they're ahead of the French, etc., etc. I wouldn't have believed that. I wouldn't have said the US will be the quickest team. But actually, it felt like they'd peaked their performance. And I know they worked really closely with the likes of Ian Stark in the build-up to it and, out there. But their performances on cross-country day were exceptional. Absolutely exceptional. We've seen them make really strong starts in the first phase at championships, and yet things have fallen by the wayside in the cross country. And yet they actually added 6.4 time penalties across their entire team and their individual rider.
Yeah, Ariel was the individual, isn't that right? And she made the time. I think Off the Record answered a big question for certainly. I think if I remember the Protoni previews and the shows that we did around that time, I think there was still a really big question around whether Off the Record was the short format horse and whether whether that combination will be able to cope with the Bertoni Hills. We had Vermiculus as one of the most reliable horses, or the most reliable cross-country horse going into the competition, going into cross-country day. That's mainly a jumping clear metric, but they did that, and they were, what was it, 5.6? So it's the 5.6 that Vermiculus adds, and it's the 2 seconds from, so 5.6 penalties, and then 0.8 penalties, 2 seconds from off the record. That's it, isn't it? Because Setzer Leg is inside the time. Lamore Masterplan is inside the time. Who am I missing? Is that it? Vermiculus, off the record.
My Bomb.
Oh, My Bomb makes the time.
My Bomb makes
time. Yeah, I think that would probably be the other one. If I was saying, I wouldn't have. I thought it would be tough on My Bomb to make the time, given what we'd seen at Badminton. What was I think about 11 time penalties at Badminton.
And actually, then you talk about off the record at Kentucky this spring with Will Coleman, and he had 7.2 time penalties and a couple of rails down show jumping and finished outside of the top 10. You know, I think he was 12th or something and felt a little bit off the radar, and yet came back very strongly in Aachen, and then obviously peaked in Pretonia and was brilliant there, particularly in the show jumping phase. I think their cross country were excellent, but the show jumping for Will Coleman was absolutely superb, and really saw him individually climb up the leaderboard as well. They were the best of the US combinations in Protoni. When we look at a high performance rating, which is the rating that actually analyzes how good an individual performance is, and you look at what it takes to win a championship or get you on a podium at a major 5-star. So from 2008 to 2016, a high performance rating of 102 would have got you on a podium at all of the major 5-stars in that time period. It's changed slightly in the last 3 major championships, and you need to be a little bit higher than that. However, Will Coleman, off the record, their high performance rating in Protoni was 102, and they've actually only been, I think, 10 high performance ratings since 2008 higher than 102 at a major championship. So he was well in the mix on that, and that, I think, just showed how strong his performance was and how strong it was for a US combination, but also in great company.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I think we'll talk about some of the high performance numbers and some more of the metrics at the end, but it is a big one-off performance. Like HPR is what measures a one-off performance. So rather than say ELO, which is more of a building metric, you know, it's something that builds over your career. HPR is just a case of did they deliver on that day. What I think is interesting with Off the Record and My Bomb, Nicole, is particularly time for My Bomb. I mentioned it a moment ago. I just was taking a quick look at what's the difference between Tammy's 2-phase average. So if you just take her dressage and her show jumping, and you compare that then to their average finishing score. Of this current group of US horses at the top of the sport who have, you know, a reasonable amount of runs over the last 3 seasons, 4 short, 4 long, and 5, My Bomb's 2-phase finishing score or 2-phase average is 26.2. There's, you know, their dressage and their show jumping combined, their average finishing score is 32. You can see that gap in there. It's not massive, but it is kind of it's where all the placings, it's where all the top placings are decided, in that somewhere between 26 and 32.9 or 33. That's where you're going to really be able to edge out your, moving from a top 10 or a top 15 into the top 3. It's, what's very interesting, I would say, this year is it's dropped a little bit. It's dropped by a mark. On both sides. So they're 2-phase average from 4 runs at this level. So not too much competition at this level in 2022, but all the big boys, you know, all in terms of competitions. But their 2-phase average across 2022 is 24.8, and their average finishing score is 31.8. There's no one better in the field. There's no one better of the US horses right now. Off the Record is next with an average finishing score from 7 competitions of 34.3. All that is to say, I think both those horses, Off the Record and My Bomb, had questions to answer about their speed cross country, and they were able to answer them. I think Zetsuleg and Lamo Master Plan, we expect it to be fast. I think for Michaelis, we expected to jump clear with a reasonable time, which they did. But the two kickers were going to be the two horses who were able to deliver good dressage, and ultimately, I think the two horses who finished in the top 10. But it's no good if you're kind of like what you saw with maybe Quantum Leap at Kentucky. It's no good if you're able to finish on your dressage score, but your dressage score is 37. There's not. I mean, it's a great building block, but what the US needed from a team point of view was 2 of their dressage supremos to be able to not add time penalties, and I think that was a really big tick in the box in terms of the team performance.
Would you like a fun fact?
Of course, yeah. Go on.
Protoni this year was the best finishing score from a US team at a major championship. So they finished on 100.3. And don't forget, it was extraordinarily close between second, third, and fourth from the team medals. But 100.3, which got them a team silver, was their best finishing score at a major championship. Their next best was, I think, 101.1 when they won bronze in Athens in 2004. So actually, the numbers again backed that up in terms of the strength of the performance there. It was the best we have seen. Where do we stand then? In terms of the big picture, because we've kind of looked at it from feel, and maybe Kentucky Badminton not quite feeling as good as we thought they might, to Protoni, actually those things all coming together, the questions all being answered. Where do we stand then, looking forward to the next couple of years? We've done the future superstars of US eventing. We've had such a strong Lilian show.
Yeah.
Where do we stand now on paper?
I think it's as good. I mean, from a ratings and a numbers point of view, things are as good as they have ever been, certainly in the last 10 years. I think there's a depth of quality there now. I think really importantly, I think there's a confidence and a buy-in into the program, which you see in almost every program around the world kind of jump around a bit. When things aren't going well, there's all sorts of reasons as to why things aren't going well, and we've got to change everything. And I think without talking about why numbers are great too much, I think the numbers are really good at balancing the emotional piece of, as I say about, say, the Tryon 2018 what would you call it? The kind of delayed qualification.
I mean, I totally got off the fence and said rock bottom. So
yeah, no, I don't. I mean, look, you're right. It felt it felt rock bottom. But what I would say on that is I think the numbers can be great at balancing that out, because it definitely wasn't rock bottom in terms of performance. But 2020, 2021, and 2022, we've seen those numbers grow and grow and grow. Like, we can take like ELO is a really interesting thing to look at, because that's a measure of kind of where the horses are rated now over their, which is more of a building. So if we talk about HVR, like you talk about for Off the Record at Protoni, that's a single result. Whereas if you look at a horse's ELO, to give you a little bit of context, the best horse in the world on our ELO rating is Fisher Chipmunk on a rating of 925. Now, he is miles ahead. Like, he's also, Chipmunk is now also, I think, second. He's second in that rating only to Sam when we look at the all-time ratings. Sam hit a rating of 973 in 2017. I don't know
this
if
is
that
taking a peak, isn't it? A peak of all time. So
it's what year did the horse? It's the horse's highest ever rating.
Yeah.
So in 2017, Levius that Sam managed to hit a rating of 973. That was off the back of a record badminton win, another Olympic win, but also had been building and building and building. But equally, what's interesting about this rating is it does begin to drop. So when we're talking about horses, so for example, Hail Bob, who we know is kind of retired now, but won't actually officially leave this rating system until they haven't competed for a year. So I think that was the Bertoni test event. So it'll be probably another 5 or 6 months before we move them from the current into the all-time. They're still in the current at the moment, but Hail Bob's peak was 913. And that was in 2020. But that gives you an idea, like the kind of 4 best horses we've ever seen, all German. 4 best horses we've ever seen on numbers, I should clarify. All German, Levius Latique Sam, Fisher Chipmunks, SFP Hail Bob, and Opgun Luvo. Now Rayo makes the list at number 5, reached 884 in 2017. Now, to bring that to the US, which is for the purpose of this show, if we look at the all-time list, the all-time top-rated horse is actually a 2022 peak, and it's Will Coleman and off the record. I think that's interesting. I don't know how people would feel about that, but that's coming from Aachen wins. It's coming from the Bertoni performance. It's also coming from Aachen fifth. Like it's essentially a measure of what quality of competition you're beating and how often you're beating them. So you're taking points from quality horses that you beat. So Aachen would have been a really big kicker in terms of building that rating. But equally, Aachen is a really big kicker in terms of how we rate a horse. It's an unbelievable competition to win. My Bomb is rated second, and Z is still rated third. I know this is a controversial one in the US, but in terms of consistency of performance, consistency of cross-country jumping, longevity is also important in this. The top 3 horses in the all-time ELO rankings are all coming from a 2022 peak, which kind of goes to that point, Nicole, of this is the high point. I think you probably begin to understand it or see it a little bit more when you actually get to 4, 5, and 6, because you begin to just feel like, wait a second, it's a bit of an easy thing to say that all the top horses, all the all-time list is all just coming from the 3 kind of informed top horses. Loch and Glen is actually 4th on the list. In 2016, Loch and Glen managed to hit an ELO of 736, and RF Tabasco for Marlon Little hit an ELO of 731 back in 2013. I can't just do a top 5. Sorry, Nickers. I can't just do a top 5 that ends on Marlon Little, because 731 is equal 5th with Van Diever, who also managed their top ELO in 2022. So those are the kind of the 5. Van Diever kind of end of career Van Diever, but the kind of top 6, say 2 and top 5 there, the front 3 are all very current and all available, and one didn't even make the team in Z, Philip Dutton. So we're in good health,
Very, very good health. And actually, Ariel Grohl features on the list as well. Liamore Masterplan in 8th from a ELO rating of this year of 716. So they again feature. But for me, on the
all-time list,
on the all-time list,
they're fourth on the current list.
The 3 on the all-time list actually are well out in front as well. We quite often see just a little bit of a difference between ELO ratings and where you stand, but 786 off the record Will Coleman, 779 My Balm, Tammy Smith, 777 Philip Dutton, and Z. All-time list then goes back to 736 Clark Montgomery, Loch and Glen. So actually, really strong health, and certainly in a very, very good position in terms of where they sit numbers-wise going into 2023. And I think that's something that we wanted to talk about on this show is, we've had a good bit of chat around how strong the US team have been this year and what we've got to look forward to. And we've talked about it a lot over the last 12, 18 months. But actually, being able to put it down in black and white and back it up on paper is really important for us to be able to say it's not just on feeling. Actually, things are looking as good as they've looked for a good while.
Yeah, and again, if you move a little bit further down the list, because again, I don't want you or anyone else to think that these lists are just compiled on kind of form and recency, and that we're not looking at this over the entire database, or able to quantify past results. Other horses that are in that list but aren't anywhere near the level of performance from a numbers point of view that we're seeing now. Like, you can go outside, like Donner, who we mentioned in terms of that 2018. Like, Donner, such a cross-country machine, such a reliable horse, such a loved horse over a long career. They hit an ELO of 713. Like, Laymore Masterplan is on 716 right now. You think about the respect and the journey that Donner took Lynn on. Laymore Masterplan is there, current and on a 716, 3 ELO marks higher. Now, 3 ELO marks is nothing, but it shows you like the level that Laymore Masterplan is at. Also, just behind Donner, Ballynoe Castle for Buck Davidson, who hit a 711 rating in 2015. RF Scandalous down at 706. Mr. Medicott for Philip on a 704. Sets her leg 697. That's Sets her leg's highest ever rating. I thought that was interesting. Like, he's outside the 700s. Vermiculus, Cambalda, Manwar de Carnville. The only thing I would say about the Mr. Medicott, Mighty Nice, and Manmore de Carnville 2013 is the rating has only had maybe 3 or 4 years to build at that point. So if it's not capturing a horse's entire career or most of their upper level career, you've got to treat it with a little bit of skepticism. So if those horses are getting some of their top level results in, but not all, then you would say, okay, I can, if it's a 2013 or 2014, maybe 2012, 2013 horse, you would probably give that a little bit of, probably give it a little bit extra, if that makes sense, without being able to quantify it perfectly. So this runs over a 12-year data set primarily, so from 2010 onwards. But for horses like Donner, De Niro Z, and Laymore Masterplan, all rated between 713 and 717, I think we do capture their top level career, and I think it's a really good indication just of where Ariel Grawl has been able to take the horses to. But equal to that, where Will has taken off the record to an ELO rating of 786, My Bomb 779, and Z 777. You're right; those three are way out in front, and I think it's it's a numbers based, but it's pretty subjective. We see a really clear correlation between ELO and big competition wins. So I think it's a really, really positive time, really strong time for the US now. And couple that with the fact that those other two nations are dropping off, I think you're in for. And finally, couple it or travel it up with the confidence that's around now. Bobby getting the job, people seeing wins on the board, seeing a togetherness. It's been building for a long time. Aachen, those Nations Cups, the Bucklow result, and then backing it up at Protoni, Nicole. I think there's a real feeling of excitement and can-do around the US. We talked about Leon, we talked about Shanroe Cooley and Liz. Liz also, again, for a third year consecutively, getting the most international wins of any rider in the world. Good things are happening there right now. It's an exciting time.
I was going to say, we've not actually spoken about Liz a huge amount on this show, and yet very much is still in the conversation as part of the bigger picture. And we saw De Niro Z back at Tryon, and I'm sure we'll see him back at 5-star level in 2023. But that is a very, very good point. International wins are plenty as well. I would say that it is looking very, very promising as we head into the next couple of years. We've got obviously Paris in 2024. We've got LA 2028. Listeners, a bit of a numbers review of US eventing in terms of top level competition in 2022. Is it as good as we think it is? Yes, the answer absolutely is. There's a lot to back that up as well. And I hope you've enjoyed it. I think it's a really, really interesting topic of conversation. I'm going to throw a couple of different numbers out there for you as well, just for a little couple of fun facts to finish the show. Best scores from this year In terms of a dressage score, the best score actually came from Will Coleman and Chin Tonic HS in a 3-star at Aiken earlier on in the year, 15.7. That was the only score in the teens. Tammy Smith actually holds 2 of the top 3 best scores on US combinations this year. Best finishing score was also sub 20, and it was also Will Coleman Chin Tonic at Aiken, 18.5. So there you go, a couple of finishing scores and record-breaking scores to leave you with. But Dee, big thank you to you. It has been a lot of fun to look down through recording this show exactly how good the US team are, and it just made me chuckle as well. I'm going to totally throw him under the bus. We had a WhatsApp group for Protoni for the preview podcast as part of our preparation, and Sam was digging around for some data on the US team this year and went back to find evidence that one member of the team, who isn't on this show, listeners, had said USA will not win a medal, and Sam took great pleasure in screenshotting it, sending it back and saying, you can eat your words. Listeners, big
Who was
thank
it? You, not me.
No, it wasn't me.
Who said that?
Am I throwing them under the bus? Will they listen to this show? Don't know.
Who was it, Spike?
It was Spike.
That's typical Spike behaviour, isn't it?
The audacity of the man. Listeners, big thank you has to go to Parker Equine Insurance for their support this year, because we have absolutely loved working with them. They've been so supportive. We've had the opportunity to do some really fun shows, not only on the eventing podcast, but on the jumping podcast as well. Do go and show them your support. And if you are in the market for some insurance and you are US based, then talk to them, because it is definitely worth exploring, and they will certainly be able to help you out. Donna and the team are just brilliant supporters of eventing and our sport, and we're very grateful to them. So do go and check them out. All of their details in the show notes to this episode as well. Dee, thank you. Listeners, thank you. US review of the year is done. We would love to know what you think, so send us your thoughts in as well, the highlights, the question marks, if you have any topics of discussion that we might look at going into 2023. We'll see what we can do. But for now, thank you very much for listening.